Welcome everybody to our NSF Texas A&M Tripods Institute's first distinguished tutorial. So we are lucky to have today as a speaker, Dr. Anuj Srivastava. So Dr. Srivastava is a distinguished research professor at the Florida State University. He is a fellow of several learned societies like IEEE, SA, IAPR, and his main interest lies in a very exciting field. I have never seen somebody integrating geometry and statistics together. So you look at the data in a geometrical way. It excites me because always I flunked in geometry in my high school. So I always thought it has to be really a great mind to do that. And he's using it in advancing inferences related to complex objects. He has a distinguished research career with huge number of research publications and books. I'm not going through them because that will take the whole time here. And especially, we love it that he makes his research really reproducible. It's usable by all of us by providing related code. So we have, actually, I know that we have used ourselves a lot of his codes to write our papers or to write our reports. So I'll finish by just saying that today he will teach us about functional and shape data analysis. We are looking forward to it. Anuj, it's yours. Okay.
Thanks very much, Bani, and thanks very much you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be at this presentation, long distance presentation, but still nevertheless exciting to be talking to you. So I want to talk about a topic area. This is a tutorial. This is not in the format of a research presentation. The goal is not to show you the latest and greatest what our research group is doing, but just to provide you sort of high-level view with some details of a certain research topics. I did mention this textbook that we wrote on this topic some time ago. It has quite a bit of material related to today's presentation, but in general terms, it's already beginning to be obsolete now. Okay, so this is the general plan. I have broken up the presentation into 4 modules. And what I want to do is, since this is a tutorial, I want to spend some time introducing, motivating this particular kind of data analysis. And then I picked up 2 topics to go into more details. I will spend about 45 minutes each on these topics, separated by a break of 10-15 minutes. If it looks a little bit too much, taking a 15-minute break, we can always cut it down. Then I was asked to supply some code to demonstrate these ideas, and I put some MATLAB code on your website, and I'll take some time to show these things to you, how they work. And if you're excited about it, then there are more codes and more advanced data analysis techniques. And I want to just wrap up in the end, time permitting, to discuss more complex objects. I want you to get excited about this area. I want you to tell you about all the latest complex data analysis one can do, which I won't be able to really do that in great detail, but I'll just give you some hints on what else can be done by talking about more complex objects. Okay, so I want to start with this, the introduction, some motivation, and some background. So I want to set this discussion that we are having today in a broader picture, in a big picture. We have diverse backgrounds. We have backgrounds in statistics, engineering, and math, I'm told, as part of this center and the institute that you have. So just to set this up, this is a brainer. This is not a headline, that we are in the age of data-driven methodologies. We are less and less focused on, let me see, I do see chats. Okay, I'll just keep an eye on what the chats are doing. We are less and less focused on advancing more traditional ways of doing statistics, but we are more and more being forced to follow data. And the data is getting more interesting, more complex, more vast. People used to call it big data. And so the question is, where is the data coming from? In this modern age, a lot of data comes from imaging sensors, imaging modalities. The nature of the data is very different depending on which sensor we are talking. If you're looking at mega scales, maybe we are talking satellite imaging, space imaging, mega scale, huge, vast terrains of data. To human scales, your cell phones are filled with pictures. Self-driving cars, they take pictures of the scene around them. We are greatly interested in medical imaging for doing diagnostics, predictions, analysis, all the way to nanoscale. So you told me that he's a student, he's an advisor of a colleague of mine who works in nano manufacturing, nanoparticle morphology. So these nanoscale structures, which could be in nanomanufacturing, but also it could be subcellular structure, imaged through electron microscopy. So across these scales, across these vastly different scales, we are getting lots and lots of imaging data. And that's forming the bulk of what we would call this big data or data-driven uh, society that we have, the data for driving that data-driven society. What is the nature of this data? What can we say about this data? Firstly, the data is complex. There are a lot of challenges in dealing with this data, but the good news is that new challenges, they inspire new solutions. Data, if you think about images, images contain objects of interest. They are pictures of somebody. There could be pictures of faces, there could be pictures of agricultural terrains, there could be picture of nanoparticles. These pictures contain objects. And our goal is to understand these objects. And I will give you lots of examples on the projects that I'm involved in. But the use of this data is to understand and analyze these objects. We want to be able to estimate or locate where these objects are. What are these objects? If it is dynamical scene, then we want to track these objects. We put some classification and prediction on their behavior, on their motion. We are primarily interested in objects of interest in these images. Okay? And one can do this in many different ways. And one of the ways that we are focused on is to understand these objects via their shapes. Okay, shape is just one explanation of the objects, one descriptor of the object. That's the one we are interested in. There are other descriptors, and one can bring them also at different stages. So why focus on shapes? What is so remarkable about shapes? In many disciplines, the shapes of the object quite predictably tell us about the functionality of the object. So think about biological systems. So even bioinformatics, think about biomolecules such as proteins or chromosomes. These proteins have certain shapes, and based on how they are bent and fold, they perform certain objects in this, they perform certain roles in a larger biosystem. So this is a very interesting line that structures both constrain and enable the functionality of the object. Because of a shape and a certain shape of an object, it cannot do other things, but because it has this shape, it can do these things. And so structure and functionality go hand in hand, and to understand what roles these different biomolecules have in the system, in the larger system, we have to understand their structures. So this is the nature of our data, the data that we are interested in. They are objects, and objects have shapes, and the shapes of objects are very highly structured. We cannot do traditional statistics like people have gotten used to doing over the last few decades. Very simple reasons. We know how to add vectors, we know how to add matrices, but we don't know how to add two shapes. How do we subtract two shapes? How do we average shapes? How do we write central limit theorems for data that involves shapes of objects? How do we do hypothesis testing and put distribution on the populations of shapes? So this leads us into very non-traditional statistics because we don't have the tools for doing this in the way we have been used to do. So this motivates the need for the language for studying structures is geometry. Geometry historically is the natural way of quantifying structures. And so we do need to bring in geometry and statistics. And if we get very ambitious, we start talking about vastly different objects, topologically different objects. So we can bring in topology also later on. So I just mentioned that this topic area is very interdisciplinary. In fact, interdisciplinary is a word that is out of favor nowadays. People talk about transdisciplinary. You have a tripods center, which brings in people from these transdisciplinary areas. And this is an example of this kind of a topic. So in this topic area, we are interested in working with data, big data of one kind or another, maybe bioinformatics, medical imaging, biology, graphics, and so on, computer vision, pattern recognition, AI. So these are the sources of data, but where is the solutions coming from? The solutions, we have to look at the combination of geometry and computational statistics. So it's at the intersection of these two. Another way to look at this is this sort of layering of ideas. This is much more traditional. When we do statistics, statistics is built on top of certain mathematical platforms. Traditionally, these platforms have Euclidean tools, Euclidean platforms. We use Euclidean spaces, Euclidean structures to do statistics. So one chooses a certain mathematical foundation, builds on top of its statistical inferences, then we use this statistical theory and approximate it or implement it using computational tools, and ultimately we apply it to data. So this is our usual progression for doing this kind of interdisciplinary data analysis. The point I am making today, especially for people who have more traditional statistics background, is that this mathematical foundation that we are used to in the past, which was primarily Euclidean, is no longer valid for studying shapes of objects. So we have to look at non-Euclidean geometries. As I said, we cannot take objects and shapes of objects and say, how do you do A plus B? We don't have those tools directly available to us. Okay? So we need novel mathematical platforms. So before I get into what I want to say, I just want to lay out some sort of ground knowledge about historically what the nomenclatures are. So I want to start with this area of functional data analysis. This is a very exciting area. This is one of the faster growing areas in all of statistics. If you go to conferences and meetings, there are lots and lots of sessions on functional data analysis. So this terminology, FDA, functional data analysis, was coined by Jim Ramsey and Bernie Silverman. They have a very nice book on this, introductory book, and then they had lots of follow-up. And so Jim Ramsey is like a father figure of this area from a statistics point of view. So this is an area of statistical analysis. This is an area of statistical analysis where the variables of interest are functions. They're not scalars, they are not vectors, they are not matrices, they are not tensors, but they are functions. Okay? And in this, historically, people talked about scalar functions on a fixed interval. That's what people typically did. Okay? And what was the mathematical platform that they used to study this? This was the Hilbert space of n-square integrable functions. How do you do calculus of these functions? The way you do it is you assume Hilbert structure, you use these inner products, you assume these norms, and you do calculus using that. I will spend a lot of time explaining these things. And once you have this choice of a metric, then under that metric, you can use a complete orthonormal basis, you can truncate representation, you can take any function and represent it by its coefficients, truncated, and now it all becomes multivariate statistics because you just have a finite number of random variables, just the random coefficients. Okay. So this is a little bit about what functional data analysis is. On the other hand, shape analysis was a completely distinct discipline in the sense that there were a completely different set of people who were working in this area. It's pioneered by really big names. Darcy Thompson has a book in 1905, very important book, and studying shapes of different objects. But for more formally and more mathematically, I think the credit goes to David Kendall in 1984, a remarkable paper in London Mathematical Society, where he actually formalized the notion of a shape. Okay. Then other people, including my mentor, Wolf Prinander, and many others have provided different variations in this in this area, and it's a very rich area, lots of activity and contributions from different people. Historically speaking, the main characterization of this work was that objects were represented by a set of points. So you have a certain object, a certain shape, you are interested in that. You would represent that object. So for example, if you had a contour, if you have a certain contour, you would represent that contour by a set of points on that object. And you'll forget about the contour and you'll restrict your analysis completely on these points, and these points were called landmarks. In fact, the main contribution of David Kendall was to be able to use this kind of representation to and formalize analysis of shapes. Okay? And I will talk more about these invariances. We will see pictorially in many different ways. Now what we want to do is sort of combine these two ideas, functional data analysis and shape data analysis. Okay? And so we can call it shape analysis of functional data. The distinction here is that the objects are represented not by discrete points, but by continua. Scalar functions or continuous curves or continuous surfaces, if we have three-dimensional objects, or so on. Continua. Of course, that makes our life somewhat more difficult. It's fun to work with discrete finite things, but continuous things make it more difficult. But we will see there is an important advantage in doing this, in going to a continuous representation. So this is more modern view of shape analysis. This is where the last 5-10 years of research have been, is to not get bogged down by discrete representation, but be more general. Okay? What are the challenges in shape analysis, generally speaking, generically speaking? The first one, I hinted briefly in the last slide, is invariance. If you take an object and if you just rotate it, or if you translate it, its shape does not change. So shape is something that is invariant to certain transformations. Transformations like rotations, translations, and even global scaling. If you zoom in and zoom out with your camera, the shape of the object remains the same. The object just scales up and scales down. So how to do an analysis, how to do calculus, how to do statistics that is invariant to these things? That's one of the challenges. It makes this aspect, this invariance makes our analysis non-Euclidean. The second, one of the most important thing in all of shape analysis is registration. Registration is that if you're comparing two objects, you want to know how different is the shape of this object with the shape of this object. Typically, if you're doing it in a way that we want to do statistically, you have to figure out which point on this object matches with which point on this object. This is called registration. There are other names to it. People may call it matching of points or correspondence of points. I'll just call it registration. So registration is also a challenge. Now, in this theory, in the theory that was pioneered in the last century, people assumed that you are given registered points. That's a huge assumption. In the data sets we get, there is no guarantee that we have any registration. We just have pictures and we have objects and we have shapes. And so we have to figure out how to solve this registration problem while we are doing shape analysis. We cannot assume that somebody has a software where you can download and implement and you can do the registration. So that's another challenge. Now, I just want to list a little bit for those people who have not seen these things before. What is a typically shape analysis? What are the things that are done? So first and foremost, shape analysis should provide a set of tools, and the first and foremost tool it should provide is shape metric. Given one object and given another object, and you can notice I'm drawing them as continuous curves. How different are these two shapes? I want to quantify how different are these two shapes. Some people call it similarity metric or some dissimilarity metric, something like that. But what we want is actually a proper metric. We want a distance. We want a distance that is symmetric, that satisfies triangle inequality, and so on and so forth. Okay? We want a proper distance. Another tool that, that is very important and we want is that if somebody gives us these two objects, object 1 and object 2, We want to be able to deform this object into that object in the most efficient fashion, in an optimal fashion. Sometimes we call them geodesics because in our language, they denote the shortest path in a certain space. Okay? And these geodesics are very important for doing statistics. There are lots and lots of methods in shape analysis, but this is one of the limitations that stops a lot of these methods from being practical. One can come up with some quantification of how different these two shapes are, but how do you deform the shape into this shape in the most efficient fashion under that same metric is a difficult task. Okay? So this is something that we need. Then getting a little bit into statistics, we want to do statistics 101. If you are given a number of shapes, let's say samples from a population, what is our estimate of the mean shape? If we can compute the mean, how does one quantify covariance? And as I was saying earlier, these notions are not easy because if we could add things and divide by n, we could get mean, but we don't know how to add the shapes of these things, okay? And so the notion of mean and the covariance and the principal component analysis, one has to sort of redesign these ideas from these non-Euclidean geometry, starting from the scratch all over again, because the traditional ideas don't work. Here is another interesting problem where I'm given two sets of shapes. One set represents samples from one population, another set represents samples from another population. And I want to do a two-sample test. I want to say, are these statistically significant or they are different shapes? Okay. I may want to do things like ANOVA and K-sample test. So I want to do a full statistical analysis, but with shape data. And that's what shape analysis should provide. All right, so this is a little bit about shape analysis and history of functional data analysis and how people studied shapes earlier. Where do we need functional and shape data analysis? Well, because I work in this area, I see their use everywhere. Maybe it's a biased opinion, but wherever you have any kind of image data, object data, or functional data, you need it. In bioinformatics, I work in biology, computer vision, earth sciences, hurricane tracking, atmospheric data, computational anatomy, diagnosis based on medical images, lifestyle data, and so on. So there are many examples. I will just flash a few examples just to give you some concrete ideas, some pictures to keep in mind as we get into theory. So this example I showed you earlier, this comes from mitochondria data. One slices these tissue, thigh tissue in mice, and they put them under microscope and they study the shapes of mitochondria inside cells. And this is a wonderful scientific problem, the problem that should motivate all of us. It says that if you have two sets of animals, in this case, the animals were mice. One set of mice were just sedentary, just sitting, not doing things, eating and sleeping. Other set of mice were forced to be active. They would do some running every day, a certain number of hours and so on. And if you have these two sets of mice, does this change in lifestyle makes a difference in the subcellular structures in their body? And one of the most important subcellular structure for exercising, for generating energy is a mitochondria in a cell. Mitochondria is the powerhouse of a cell. And so this was a very interesting problem somebody posed to us, and it's a very exciting research to show that they are actually statistically significantly different between the two sets. In biology, we have examples. So for example, you may have seen some apps where people take pictures of leaves and try to specify what species of plant or tree these leaves come from. You may have a data for full tree. This is very difficult, complex problem, somewhat exciting. We are working on it. We have these laser scans of full trees, and we are trying to quantify how different are these two trees. How do you deform this tree into that tree? Okay. I mentioned bioinformatics, proteins, shape analysis of proteins. Protein structure analysis is a very important field. But one of the more exciting newer field is a lot of statisticians in the past have worked with genome data, but they mostly work with genome expression data. But now we are beginning to get data on the shapes of the genomes. So in our cells, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. We can actually start getting data to estimate the shapes of these chromosomes. And if we have this data, then of course that leads to the next step, is how to analyze, how to compare the shapes of these chromosomes across cells, across people, across population. You can do some genetic engineering and then see, does it affect the shape of the chromosome? One of the very exciting areas is neuron morphology. A lot of studies in brain relate, especially the cognitive abilities relate to neuronal networks inside the brain, how neurons connect and propagate information. And now we are beginning to have, these are huge databases. One is called Neuromorph, which have hundreds of thousands of structures of individual neurons stored in it. And because there is data, there is a great interest in quantifying neuron morphology. And you can see the structures getting more and more complex. To be able to compare these things, compare the structures of these things is going to be more complicated. So this is a slide from my colleague Chivu Park's research and his advisor, Dr. Yu here, where you take images during a manufacturing process. You have these video sequences. Each frame contains hundreds of thousands of nanoparticles. And at each frame, you can imagine a population of shapes. These are not individual shapes. These are populations of shapes. And one is interested in the dynamics of this population. How's the population evolving? You're not interested in how the single shape is evolving, but whole population of shape is evolving. So it's a very exciting application. Human body, of course, has always been a great fascinating topic for everybody to study. Face recognition, thousands of papers, tens of thousands of papers every year on face recognition or shape analysis of faces. One can be interested in the full body design, not just face itself or part of body, just the full. So that's another type of data where shape analysis is important. I have spent quite a bit of time working with, sorry, there is a typo, in computational anatomy. And what computational anatomy does is we are looking at things like MRI scans of human brains. And we are interested in analyzing structures, especially subcortical structures, structures like hippocampus, amygdala, putamen. These are very small, like size of a pinky. This hippocampus is in the brain on the left and the right size. And we are interested in extracting these structures from MRI scans and analyzing these structures for quantifying or predicting things like Alzheimer's, schizophrenia. There is tremendous amount of research in this area. PTSD is a relatively new and untouched topic, and we have an ongoing project in trying to analyze post-traumatic syndromes and connecting them with the shape of the structures of subcortical parts in your brain. There are a few more applications. There is a human surveillance where one uses these Kinect type sensors to measure the shape of a human body. Somebody is performing a certain action under surveillance, and you estimate a skeleton of that person's body shape, and it changes over time. And the goal is to analyze these sequences, skeletal sequences, to study what action is being performed. Is the action being performed very well or not? So you can imagine things like physiotherapy, remote physiotherapy, and all kinds of applications where one can use these remote sensing to analyze human activities. More recently, we have started working with even more complicated objects. This is an example of veins, extracted arteries and veins extracted from these iris images, retinal images. And from these images, we extract these graph-like structures. One can call it the graphical representation for the vasculature. And the idea is to relate things like diagnosis of different abnormalities in vision, relate them to the changes in the structure of this vasculature. I'll mention one more, another more complicated, highly complicated problem is brain arterial network. This is a network of arteries in human brain. And again, one can get this data for individual humans, and then one can try to relate how these arterial networks change if, for example, from an injury. If the brain has a certain injury and is recovering from an injury, how will these things change? How do you quantify these things? So these are a number of examples I pose just as motivational examples. I just want to get a little bit more abstract and mathematical about what is the nature of these objects. So some of the simpler objects I showed you were just curves. So maybe they were two-dimensional curves, simple closed curves in a plane. For proteins, we can view them as a curves in 3 dimension. And sometimes we can view them as curves in a much higher dimension. Sometimes we have a collection of curves like neurons. Neurons, we had a main branch, an axon, and then we have side branches coming out of it. Or we looked at some botanical trees where we have a main stem and then we have side branches. So it's not just one curve, but a collection of curves. We have looked at human bodies and human faces, which can be thought of as surfaces. And there are many more other examples of mathematical formulation of these objects. But the simplest example of a shape is a scalar function on a unit interval. Now you may say that that's too simple. I'm not really interested in shapes of scalar functions, but I'm going to use this as an example to motivate the theory, even if you're not really interested in that. Because that's the easiest one to explain the methods and the solution, because you can visualize a lot. It's that simple. Now, once we have solutions from this theory of studying shapes of simple scalar functions, we can apply it, the same theory, to other more complicated objects. So I want to get into a little bit on the background of shape analysis. This was a little bit of a motivation. Barney mentioned geometry and geometry classes. So my son is taking a high school geometry class. And so that reminded me of some things we studied about congruency. So what was congruent objects? Congruent objects was that if you take an object and just simply rotate and translate it, then it remains congruent to its original self. And for a triangle, the way we teach congruency is if all the 3 angles are same in a triangle, actually, and all the 3 angles are same and all the 3 sides are same, then we call it, the length of the 3 sides are same, then we call it a congruent triangle. But we also teach at that high school level what it means to be similar. And in this case, we allow not just rotation and translation, but also scaling. If we take an object and not only rotate it, but also scale it differently, so we can zoom in and zoom out, then we no longer call them congruent objects, we call them similar objects. So these are similar triangles. Okay? And that's the notion of shape that I'm going to work with. These transformations, rotation, translation, scale, people call them similarity transformation because they leave the objects similar. They don't change the object. In our language, we call them shape preserving transformation because they preserve the shape. They don't change the shape. Okay. All right. So for more complicated objects, same thing. All of these objects in this picture have exactly the same shape. They have different rotations, they have different translations, they have different scales, but they are only shape preserving transformations. And in some sense, the main achievement that Kendall reached in his paper in 1984 was he provided a formal mathematics, a quotient space calculus, which I'll refer to a little bit later, for doing analysis of objects, of shapes of objects, while being invariant to these transformations. Keeping that in mind, we see that we run into one more problem, especially when we are working with functional data. In case of continuous object, we not only will have rotation, translation, and scale, but we'll also have another kind of transformation. For example, let's say we have a curve, a parametrized curve, and it has a certain shape. If we reparameterize the curve, it still has the same shape. So there is yet another transformation which leaves shape unchanged, another kind of shape preserving transformation. So by working with continuous objects, which is the choice we made earlier, we not only have to worry about rotation, translation, scaling, we also have to worry about things like parameterizations of objects. Okay? And so this is a little bit of a background in geometry. If you follow it, that's great. If you don't follow it, that's fine. It's not that critical. But this is the formal language for doing geometry. So these transformations that we want to study, these rotation, translation, scales, these actually form groups. What is a group? A group is a set in which you have a certain binary operation and you have an identity element. So for example, I'll just work with some examples. So translation group. Translation group is nothing but Rn. Rn is called a translation group. This Euclidean space, the group operation here is addition. I have two vectors. If I add them up, I get another vector. Okay. The identity element is 0. It's an identity element is that element of the group that remains things unchanged. So if I translate by 0, nothing happens. Similarly, scaling. Scaling is a set of positive numbers, and their group operation is multiplication. If I take two positive numbers and I multiply, I still get a positive number. And the identity element is +1. If I multiply any number with +1, nothing changes. This is an interesting group, the group of all rotation matrices, all n by n rotation matrices. This is also a group, and the operation is matrix multiplication, and its identity element is the identity matrix of that size. Finally, so this was the translation, scaling, and rotation, but in terms of reparameterization, there is a new group that comes in, and I'll talk more about this later. This is a more complicated group, and I need to show you more pictures. And the way we incorporate this group in our shape analysis is something called a group action. That if we have a certain space, then this group acts on a certain space and it follows certain rules. And once again, this is the mathematics, but I would like to show it to you via examples. So if I have an object, and if I take all the points on this object and translate all of them by the same vector, then I apply the translation group. All the points, they get translated by the same element y. Okay, so this is a rigid translation. Similarly, I have rigid rotation. I take all the points on an object and I rotate them by the same matrix, I get a rigid rotation. These are called actions of the group. So this is an action of the rotation group of the object. Similarly, we have an action of the scaling group. If I multiply each point on an object by a positive scalar, then I scale that object up and down. Why are we talking about group action? What is the advantage of being so formal about this and making a theory out of it? Is that these group actions concatenate because you have composition. So if you translate one object and then you translate it again, you can represent the cumulative translation as another group element because one translation plus the second translation is a group operation. Same way, if you rotate an object and then rotate it again, then the total rotation is just the first rotation times the second rotation. These are two matrices, and you can just multiply the two matrices to get the cumulative rotation. Same way with scaling. So the important point of viewing these objects, these transformations, as group operations is you can compose these things and you can look at the joint composite group action and you can talk about that. So this is the last group that I wanted to talk about. This was, we call it the diffeomorphism group, and I'll explain it in this context. Suppose I have a certain function f. Okay? So I work with this function. I have a group of all diffeomorphisms on 0, 1. Diffeomorphisms are smooth functions. They are invertible and the inverses are smooth. These diffeomorphisms have a property that they start at 0, 0 and they end at 1, 1. So they're always climbing and they're climbing smoothly. The set of all such functions forms a group and it forms a group under compositions. Okay? You can compose any two functions and you will get a function of this type. What is the identity element of the group? Is just a straight line. Okay? What is the action? If I take this gamma, sometimes we call it time warping. If I take one time warping function and compose it with f, so I compute f composed f, which basically means f of gamma of t. Okay. So what I'm doing here is by applying it, I get these things on the right-hand side. It basically shifts the value of f, any point in f, this group action, it moves it left or right. All the values in this function, by applying this group action, they just get shifted horizontally. There is no vertical move. It's just horizontal shifts. Okay. And so this is another kind of group which is very important for shape analysis, as we'll see. Now, I want to end a little bit more mathematical. I want to end this particular introduction with a little bit more mathematical end note, which is important for shape analysis. Shapes are not represented by single points in any space. You cannot say I have a triangle, I have a set of 3 points, and set of 3 points represent a shape. No, because if you take that shape and if you translate it, it's still the same shape. But the 3 endpoints are now different. The coordinates have changed because of translation, rotation, scaling. So shapes are not represented by individual points. They are represented by all possible rotations, translations, scales, and reparameterizations. So shapes are sets. They're not just one individual points which you can do calculus on. These things are called orbits. Orbits are, you start with a certain point in a certain space. Maybe I start with one triangle and I apply a group. Let's say I apply a translation group. If I apply all possible translations on the triangle, I get infinitely many triangles. All those triangles have exactly the same shape. So this whole translation orbit of the triangle represents the same shape. So shapes are represented by these things called orbits. And the set of these orbits is what is called a quotient space. So we'll get to that in a minute. But here again, I have an example. If I start with one point x in Rn and apply all possible translations, I get all of Rn. So the orbit of translation orbit of a point in Rn is all of Rn. So these are some examples of what orbits look like. So for example, in this case, I had a function. I have a function and I am applying certain time warpings to it and I get these results. So these are all elements of the same time warping orbits. If I apply all possible time warping functions to this function, I'll get one orbit of this function. Okay. All right. And ultimately, the shape space, the shape analysis, this is one of the achievements of David Kendall was that for his mathematical setup, he showed that the shape spaces are not just individual set of points, but they are set of orbits. These things are called quotient spaces, and these are the set of orbits. Each point in the set is an orbit, all possible rotation, translation, scaling, everything of one object, one shape. And in order to compare shapes, in order to compare two shapes, as I said, shapes are represented by orbits. If I have two orbits, I have to do this kind of minimization. You may have seen this thing. Some people who do Procrustes type analysis do this. You fix one object and you find the best transformation, best rotation, best scaling, best translation of the second object to align it as well as you can with the first object. And then you compute the distance. And once you align the two objects and then you look at the residual, that forms the distance and which is called the shape space. All right, so this was a little bit of a background. I'm running a little bit behind time, but that's okay. I want to make sure that I get these backgrounds clear. I can skip some other material later on. So the third part that I want to, in the introduction, I want to talk about is the history of functional data analysis, a little bit more details. I want to mention that because I'm not assuming that students or present here in this audience have background in functional data analysis. So functional data analysis is done in a certain space, and the most commonly chosen structure, most commonly used metric or representation for doing functional data analysis, is called the Hilbert space of square integrable functions. It's a vector space. It's a Hilbert space because it has an inner product. This is the classical inner product between two functions. These functions can be vector valued or scalar valued, it's fine. This inner product defines a norm, Hilbert norm. We also call it L2 norm. It's nothing but square root of the integral of the square of differences. Okay. And under this norm, we have this set L2 space, which is a set of all functions whose L2 norm is finite. This is the mathematical structure which is perhaps used in almost all literature on functional data analysis. You can pick up any paper in statistics on functional data analysis. Explicitly or implicitly, they would be comparing functions or analyzing functions using these norms, using these metrics. Okay. There are, of course, exceptions, but this is the most traditional thing. There are some things that are very well known about these kind of norms, that if you have 2 points in this L2 space and you want to know under this metric what is the shortest path between them, because this is a vector space, the shortest path between them is a straight line. Whenever you have a vector space and you want to go from one point to another, the shortest path under the original Euclidean metric is a straight line. You know, few more things about it, which are quite convenient, and that's one of the reasons this is used, that if you are given a bunch of functions, let's say you observe a set of functions from some population, you can estimate the mean of the population by just doing sample means. This is what we think would be a natural answer, and that's what it turns out to be the natural answer. That a mean of it's called a cross-sectional mean. For each time, we just average the heights of the functions. So this is a natural estimate for the mean of functions sampled from a population. There is another way of looking at it, that under the L2 norm, this mean is actually the point that minimizes sum of squares of distances to the given data. That's another way to understand this definition of mean. Once you have a mean, you can compute the covariance. We are in a continuum, so covariance is like a continuous tensor. It's a function of two variables. People also study this as bounded linear operators of this type, and under certain conditions, these operators have eigen decompositions, and therefore one can write any observed function, random function, as a linear combination of its eigenfunctions. It's very similar to the discrete theory, but one can formalize it and study the continuous version of the theory. But in practice, what do? In practice, we just discretize the functions on a dense grid, compute everything as if they were vectors, and we completely shamelessly just apply the discrete theory and ignore the fact that they are continuous functions. And that's fine, that we have theory to show that that is a good approximation under this norm structure of square integrable spaces. Okay. I just want to show you some examples of this principal component analysis. So I have a set of functions here, f1, f2, and so on. I compute their mean. This is what the mean looks like. This is what the singular values of the covariance matrix looks like. This is the most dominant singular direction, singular vector direction. Okay. Just to contrast this, I provide another example where I have a number of functions, and notice these functions have these are all unimodal. They have similar shape, but they are slightly shifted from each other, and they're slightly different in the heights. So the main difference lies mainly in the shifts of the peaks. And if I average these functions, I get an average that looks like this. And in a minute, I'm going to tell you that's problematic. But if I just continue, I can do principal component analysis. I can look at the first principal direction, second principal direction, and so on. So I have this L2 space where I can do these calculations because I have a metric, I have a norm, And it's so-called vector space. It's a flat metric. I can average things. I can compute differences, A plus B, A minus B, A times a scalar. All of these things are available and I can do it. I just want to make a quick note that a lot of these calculations, when we do this thing in practice, we do with discretizations. Even though when I'm giving the talk, I talk about continuous inner products. What I'm assuming is that I have samples of these functions on a fixed dense uniform grid. So I can approximate integrals by finite sums. If I don't have them, suppose I have sparse data, functional data, non-uniformly sampled, maybe has noise in it, then I will use some techniques to resample these functions and reach a dense grid so I can do this kind of calculation. Just a note that in practice, this is what we do. Okay, so this is a background on a little bit on shape analysis and a little bit on functional data analysis as it is done in most of the literature using the L2 metric. Now I want to start talking about what is wrong with it. Our hypothesis is one should not look at the functions directly. One should focus on the shapes of the functions instead. That's more valuable, that's more interesting. Why so? Here is an example. In this example, in this picture, I have three functions, F1, F2, and F3. F1 is in red, F2 is in blue, F3 is in this pink magenta line. If I calculate the pairwise L2 distances, L2 norms, I get these distances that look like this. If I ask you which two functions are more similar than the third function, you'll probably say F1 is similar to F2, more similar to F2 than it is similar to F3. But that intuition turns out to be wrong under the L2 metric. Under the L2 metric, the distance between 1 and 3 is smaller than the distance between 1 and 2, which is surprising. Visually, they look quite similar, except they have shifts. There is a shift. I can take it to an extreme, and in this case, the distance between F1 and F3 is smaller than the distance between F1 and F2. And again, the difference is because of a shift. The shift is something called phase variability, and this phase variability is a big nuisance in functional data. It's something very special to functional data. It's not present in our vector calculus, multivariate calculus, tensor calculus, and so on. Only in functional data we run into this situation that you may have peaks which are slightly shifted. And even if they are slightly shifted, we pay a large price. It can make a big difference in terms of L2 norm. So suppose I was classifying this functional data using L2 norm, I'll end up classifying red with pink rather than red with blue, which would be wrong in most applications. There are some other problems. So for example, if I take this average of functions, so in this example, I have a lot of bimodal functions. So you can see in colors, each color represents a bimodal function. The two peaks are there for each function, but the peaks are shifted. They're not lined up. If I compute an average of these bimodal function, I get this black function with so many peaks. So that's certainly a bad representative. I'm taking an average of lots of bimodal function and I get a function which has 4 or 5 modes. Another way of looking at the problem is that I have a mean and I have a band around it which shows visually the variation in the data. So it's mean plus 1 standard deviation and mean minus 1 standard deviation. And you can see that there is a tremendous amount of variance, vertical variance. Although the variance in the data was not as much vertical, they had the same heights mostly. The variability in the data was that the peaks were just shifted left and right. But if I do this, if I use L2 norm without caring for this issue, I start getting this inflated variance. And covariance is almost everything in statistics. We do PCA, we do everything. ANOVA, we do everything with covariance. And we get this inflated covariance because of this so-called phase variability, this horizontal shifting. There are some other examples I can show, but I want to get to the point. So what is the real issue here? The real issue is when I'm computing the L2 norm, L2 norm is based on this difference, F1 of t minus F2 of t. For any t, I'm comparing F1t with F2 of t. I'm assuming a vertical registration between two functions. That for each t, F1 of t is always matched with F2 of t. For each t. If I use this registration, there is a lot of difference, a lot of variance in between these two functions. In fact, if I use this registration to interpolate between the two functions, I get an interpolation which looks like this. One peak is dying down and other peak is getting created. And in the middle, I get functions which are neither peaks, completely shapeless. And the problem in this picture was that I assumed that F1 of t is matched with F2 of t in this comparison, that the registration, the correspondence between the functions is vertical. Now, instead of doing vertical, I take a slightly different example. And in this example, I have two functions. If I assume the registration is completely horizontal, that looks much more natural comparison of the two functions. I'm matching the peak with the peak, and these rising points with the rising points, and the falling points with the falling points. So in this example, very special constructed example, the whole registration is horizontal. In this particular example, vertical registration is bad. If I use this registration to interpolate between the two functions, I get this sequence of functions which are very nicely preserving the shapes. Okay. But in general, in between any two arbitrary functions, the variability may neither be vertical, may not be horizontal, but it may be a combination of these two. The best registration between two functions may be of this type, as you see in this picture. So I want to start using more general registration between the functions. I want to discard this use of vertical registration. In other words, I want to completely discard using L2 norm. I want to use this kind of registration. And if I use this registration to do an interpolation, you can see I get a very beautiful interpolation between the blue curve and the red curve. Okay. How should one go about doing it? Remember time warping? This is how time warping comes in handy. I have two functions, F1 and F2, same functions I showed in the last slide. What I'm going to do is I'm going to find the time warping function. Remember, time warping function was a function that starts at 0, 0, ends at 1, 1, and is always smoothly climbing. Okay. I'm going to find a time warping function, and I will time warp one of them. Let's say blue one. I will time warp the blue one into this magenta one. And time warping simply moves the peaks left and right. It doesn't do any vertical thing. It will move blue into magenta horizontally. And based on the nature of this time warping, some points move more, some points move less, some points don't move at all, some move left, some move right. It's a nonlinear time warping. But if I do the warping correctly in such a way that I line up exactly the peaks and the valleys. So in this function, let's see if I zoom in there. If I do the time warping correctly, and if I can line up the peaks and valleys correctly, then the only thing that is left is the vertical variability. The difference between the red and the magenta, you can see after lining the peaks and valleys, the residuals are very nicely vertical. So this is how I want to find this registration, which has both vertical and horizontal component. I want to find the best time warping, a gamma function, such that F2 of gamma has peaks and valleys which are aligned very nicely with peaks and valleys of the right function. This is called functional alignment, phase amplitude separation. There are many, many names for it. There's been at least 15, 20 years worth of research. A lot of people, Louis Knipe, Jim Ramsey, Hans Mueller, have sequence of papers on trying to align peaks and valleys of functions, scalar functions. And what did they do? They started with, the natural choice was, if I want to align a function f1 with the time warped version of f2, I just simply compute the difference between the L2 norm and I try to minimize it. This is what one would start with naturally, because that's the only norm we know so far. It's a very convenient norm. Turns out that this norm is degenerate. I have two very different functions and I can reduce the difference between them to 0 under the L2 norm by just pinching a part of the curve. Take a big part of the curve and pinch it into singularity. And I can have this time warping function which almost climbs vertically. So this was a non-starter because this is degenerate. You can give me two very different functions and I can make this difference almost 0. It's degenerate. So what do statisticians do if they run into degeneracy? They add penalties. So one can add penalties. So instead of doing very drastic time warping, they say don't be very drastic. So they put some kind of smoothing penalties, and as the penalty increases, the warping becomes less and less. But this is not really the solution. The problem with putting these penalties is that you can improve the solution, and I have this sequence. I start with two functions. In this picture, I start with two functions. And in the left column, I time warp F2 to align with F1. In the right column, I time warp F1 to align with F1. And this is where the penalty is increasing. As I increase more and more penalty, what we find out, the solution is no longer symmetric. This is the most commonly used way of alignment in all of functional data analysis. You can pick up any paper, you can pick up any software, any R package on doing functional data analysis. This is what they use. The problem with this is the alignment of F1 to F2 is not symmetric to the alignment of F2 to F1. So if you have two images, MRI images, or two pictures, and depending on the order in which you feed the data to the computer program can completely change your result. So that's completely hard to explain to a physician when you're giving the results, explaining the results. Okay. An alternate solution is what I'm going to spend some time explaining, and I have computer code to show it to you, is that something without penalty, no penalty based, completely automatic, and the results are completely symmetric. The alignment of A to B will give exactly the same result as alignment of B to A. The two warping functions that you get from one side or the other side, if you compose them, you get perfect identity. That means one warping is exactly the inverse of the other warping. Okay. So this is the method I'm going to explain, but I do have also code in that package to show you that if you do this, then what can things go wrong? What can go wrong? All right, so what is the solution? There are some mathematical arguments for building it. I don't really have time to really develop a solution. I'll just tell you the solution. You can ask, did I pull it out of thin air? No, of course not. We have a very fundamental derivation. And this derivation is based on, earlier we were talking about CRR. There's a metric called Fischer Raw Metric. It is used a lot in physics. It's almost inexisting in statistics literature, at least in the last 20, 30 years. It has been used historically, but in a parametric setting. So I will talk a little bit about it. So the point is that we will completely abandon the L2 norm. We'll come up with a new distance, and the new distance will have some properties. And the most important property it will have is this. It's called invariance of the group action. If I take two functions, so let me do it via this picture. If I have two functions, F1 and F2, if I time warp both of them by the same warping function, you can see in this picture, if I have a certain vertical registration between the two functions. If I time warp by the same gamma, then the vertical registration does not change. The peak was matched with peak earlier, and it is still matched, because a point on the red curve moves in exactly the same way as the corresponding point on the blue curve, because we are moving them by the same gamma. So this picture tells us that the registration remains unchanged under identical time warping. And this is manifested in our need to have a metric that the metric should also remain unchanged. If I take two functions and time warp them by the same gamma, then the distance, the metric I'm using to do the registration should also be unchanged. And there are very few metrics that actually satisfy this property and are still proper distances and have inner products and so on. And one of them is called the Fischer Raw Metric. It relates to Cramér-Rao bound and Fisher information matrix that we study and teach for parametric statistics, parameter estimation, and errors in parameters, estimation of errors in parametric estimation. It relates to that, but it has a quite different form in non-parametric setting, in a functional form. I don't have the time to show it to you, but I have a way of using it. It's actually quite a complicated metric. It's not so easy to explain it to you, the form. Now, this metric was for a long time known for functional data and somewhat explored. Then around this 2007 period, my colleague Eric Claassen introduced a mathematical form which we call the square root velocity function. That's really the critical part. This is one of main contributions from our group that made this field grow much faster. So what is that? I start with the function f, I compute its derivative, and I divide by the square root of the norm of the derivative. And this formula is valid in all of our Rn. So it's valid for scalar functions, it's valid for vector functions in any dimension. So instead of working with the original function f, we compute an SRVF, which we'll call q, and we'll work with q. Now one can always go back from q to f using the integration, okay, using the formula. So it's a fully invertible representation. Because it is based on a derivative, you lose a constant. So you have to keep at least one constant to be able to go back. The advantage of using this representation is this formula. That actually, where is the main formula that I want to say? It's this formula. That this Fischer Raw distance, Fischer Raw metric, which I said has nice mathematical properties, but it's quite complicated to work with. That's why even for decades people knew about it. People never really used it. Now, it turns out that if you go into the space of SRVFs, if you want to compute the Fischer Raw distance between two functions f1 and f2, you compute their SRVFs exactly using this formula, and you get q1 and q2. If you compute the L2 norm between these two functions, that is exactly the Fischer Raw distance. So that's a remarkable simplification for a metric which has such beautiful mathematical properties, but is really a horrific thing to look at. The beauty of this SRVF was that the moment you compute SRVF, you're back to L2 norm. We're not computing L2 norm between the original functions, but we are computing L2 norms between their SRVFs, because that equals this metric. And it has all the nice properties that if you take two functions and compute their SRVFs, we compute the distance before the reparametrization, we compute the distance after the reparametrization. It's a one-line proof that the distance remains the same, it remains invariant. And because of this invariance, we can solve this registration problem, which if I had used the L2 norm on the original functions, this would have been a degenerate solution. And that's where people have been putting regularization penalties for years. But here, what we are doing is simply compute the SRVFs of the two functions, q1 and q2, and solve this L2 norm minimization. It's almost the same code as people have been using for ages, but with a few things added in there, that instead of functions directly, you work with SRVFs. And this can be solved, and this gives an optimization. Okay. And so I'm going to, when I get to in the end, then I get to the demos using MATLAB. I'll show you many examples, but I have just a couple of pictures. This is a problem I have worked with people at NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technologies. They have this data called mass spectrometry data. let me zoom into it. It's a very peaky data. They put some substance into mass spectrometer and they look at the signature of a substance. And the problem is that even if you take the same substance and put it in two different machines, you get signatures which are not exactly lined up. The peaks are slightly shifted. They have slightly different peaks, slightly different heights. In fact, these are the two signatures of exactly the same material. Okay. So they're greatly interested in lining up the peaks and valleys. They're greatly interested in this alignment. And so we take these two functions, compute their SRVFs, and solve this problem using this dynamic programming algorithm. I'll give you the code for that. And after that, there is no input, there is no hand manipulation, there is no parameter tuning. You can see, if you zoom in, you can see how well aligned the peaks and valleys are. This is fully automatic. There is no labeling of peaks. In fact, I have some zoom ins before and after. So left is before and right is after. So this is a fully automated way of registering using time warp for doing this for functions. Right now I showed you how to do it for two functions. One can do it for multiple functions. Because this infimum, I solve for this, this minimization. This is not only a minimization problem, it has a lot more mathematical properties than I have time to tell you. In fact, this infimum is a proper metric on its own on a certain quotient space. Because it's a proper metric, I can define means and I can define covariances in this space, which is after registering the functions. So if you give me, instead of two functions, if you give me hundreds of functions and you say, can you register those? Yes, I can. So the way I can do it is, because I have a metric, I compute the means of all these functions and register each one of these functions to the same mean. Okay. And here are some examples. Again, these are pictures. I'll show you these things live running. This is the input to the code. Give me a number of functions. In fact, this particular set of functions come from one of Jim Ramsey's JASA paper. They model, Jim Ramsey and Alois Knight, they model this data and they try to align it in different ways using these penalized metrics that I mentioned, penalized L2 metric. And they don't quite succeed. If you read the paper, they have very few examples of the actual alignment. Here, this code goes into the program and we get these two outputs. One is the aligned set of functions and other is the time warpings that aligns these functions. So these are the time warping. This time warping gets applied to one of the functions to result in this one of the functions. So I have 29, 30 functions here, and these are aligned. And so one can do this to real data, one can do this to simulated data. If you work in functional data analysis, you must be very familiar with something called Berkeley growth data. And Berkeley growth data is something about the rate at which we grow in height over the years. So these are the rate curves for some individuals, 30, 40, 50 individuals. And the peaks, these small peaks represent growth spurts. None of us grows in a linear fashion. We grow a lot and then we don't grow for a while, then we grow again, and then we don't grow for a while. These things are called growth spurts. The highest growth spurt is, of course, when we are born. But over the years, there are some growth spurts at a later period. So they want to know when are the growth spurts typically on average for boys and for girls. And so in this data set, if you look at the overall average, just without any alignment, just the raw data, if you compute the average, all the peaks are washed out because peaks are not lining up, different body cycles. You just average them and the average will be something like this. You won't be able to see any peaks. But if you use this code and you align them, you see very clearly peaks, and you can actually test that some of the peaks are statistically significant peaks over and beyond the noise. So this program, again, is fully automated and quite fast and provides results. Okay. So in how many ways we can use this code. You can take this functional data, any functional data input to the code, break it up into aligned functions, or what we call amplitudes or Y variability, and the other set, which is the phase component or X variability. You can break up the original data into these phase and amplitude and then do the analysis separately. Sometimes it's very more convenient to, rather than working with the functions, you work with some transformation of the function. So for example, you look at the absolute values of the functions, because you don't want to align peaks with peaks. Maybe you want to align all the critical points with all the critical points. So in this case, we look at these functions. If we just directly run the code on the original functions, we get this. Excuse me. We align peaks with peaks and valleys with valleys. Instead, if we first take absolute values of these functions and then align them and take these warping functions and apply it to the original data, we see that we get a slightly different kind of alignment. And in some applications, that might be more interesting. Another example is when you have monotonic functions. In the next slide, I'm going to talk about COVID data. When you're looking at the cumulative counts of COVID data, these are monotonic functions. The number of people infected with COVID is increasing. So instead of working with the original data, what we often do is we look at the time derivative of the data. This is very similar to the growth curves. We don't look at the heights, we look at the rate at which heights are growing. Similarly, how many new patients we get every day in COVID. So you take the time derivatives and then you align the time derivatives, and that has sometimes much more interesting information. So what do we do with this? I did mention this briefly, that once you have this code for separating functions into the amplitudes and phases, you can return, because now in these spaces, you can apply more traditional statistics. If we start doing the mean and the covariance in the original space, you will lose all the structure. But if we compute the mean and the covariance in this space and mean and covariance in this space separately, you have a great preservation of structure. And in the end, you can combine the statistical model. Think of it as like you have a complex number and you break it up into its magnitude and its phase. And you do like a polar representation of a point in a plane, two-dimensional plane. Instead of Cartesian coordinate, we work with polar coordinates, radius and an angle. And in some cases, this is a much more convenient way of studying functional data. So I mentioned this, this COVID. So on the left, what we have are 51 curves. Each curve represents a state. So 50 states plus Washington, DC. These are the cumulative counts of positive COVID detections over time. And this, of course, is New York, which grew very fast earlier on. And then there are other states. And this data is only up to first week of August. So it's not absolutely the latest data. What we do is we look at the time derivatives. We don't look at the cumulative counts. We look at the new counts every day. So we look at the time derivatives. And time derivatives look like this. Furthermore, we want to normalize them because some states are smaller, some states are bigger. So we smooth these curves and we normalize them by having the area below the curve for each state be 1. Just vertical scaling. We just scale these curves. And now we get these curves. This is an overall average curve that we get. You see the pictures on news channels and newspapers that looks like this. This is till start of August. This is an overall average rate curve for the country, but these are the 50 curves for different states, and we want to see what patterns are there for different states. And so what we do is we compute this distance going all the way back. We have a way of computing this distance between two states. For one state, I have its SRVF. For another state, I have its SRVF. I align the peaks and valleys of the two states, and I compute a distance, and I use this distance, we call it a shape distance or an amplitude distance. Based on that, I cluster different states, and I get a clustering that looks like this. So I have a certain clustering, and you can look at this. It turns out Hawaii is an outlier because it was very low for a long time, and it has shot up exponentially in late July, early August. Okay? But the other states, they break up into these 3 or 4 clusters, 3 dominant clusters. In one case, this was New York, cluster of New York, where it went high very early and then came down. Then there are other states, this is where Florida is, that it was low earlier on, but then it peaked later and is beginning to come down. There are some other states, some Midwestern states that went up, came down and went up. So there are 2 really dominant peaks in this. There is a 4th cluster, which is, it was low and high and is still going high. It's not coming down. Okay. So one can use the shapes of these things to actually do clustering of the data. All right, so we have arrived at our coffee break about 10 minutes behind schedule, which is okay, not too bad. And so let me check with Dr. Yu. Okay. So now in this next topic, we go to slightly higher dimension. Now we are going to talk about shapes of curves. And one can talk about all Euclidean curves, but specifically we'll talk about shapes of planar curves. Okay. Now, why do we want to study shapes of planar curves? Lots and lots of applications, especially in computer vision, pattern recognition. We look at images and we look at the silhouettes of objects in images, and the silhouettes look like this. And we are interested in comparing shapes of these objects. In 3 dimensions, I mentioned the study of chromosomes. So we estimate these complicated, complex curves, but these are curves in R3, space curves. And for different chromosomes, you get these different structures, and you want to compare or analyze shapes of these curves. For nanoparticles, you have these planar, simple closed curves, and you're interested in analyzing a shape curve. So there are many different applications. What is the nature of mathematical representation? So we can represent these curves, generally speaking, as some functions. Earlier, we were working with scalar functions, but now we can talk about some functions in a Euclidean space. So k equals 2 for planar curves, k equals 3 for 3D curves. The domain, sometimes when we have curves that are not connecting, closing on themselves, we use the domain, which is an open interval. When we have closed curves, we use the domain F to be a unit circle. So this is the representation we use for simple closed curves in a plane, because it's more natural, because they have no corners, these closed curves. So their domain S1, the unit circle, also has no corners. And one can even look at more general things like curves on a manifold. Suppose you have a sequence of covariances evolving over time. We call them covariance trajectories. And so they are curves not in a Euclidean space, but on a space of all covariance matrices. So these are called covariance trajectories. So, or a sphere. So for example, when we model hurricane data, hurricanes are traveling in Earth coordinates. Earth is a sphere. So these are spherical trajectories. So you can have Euclidean curves, and you can have more general curves on arbitrary manifolds. The problem of registration, which we started talking about for these scalar functions, is much more critical, much more relevant for shape analysis of curves. If I want to compare shape of this object, the shape of this object, and I want to do this in a dense registration way, I need to figure out which point. For every point here, I need to figure out which is the corresponding point on the other object. So that registration problem still holds. Now somebody will say, can I do the registration by not allowing arbitrary parameterization of the curves, but an arc length parameterization? That means if I start traveling on the curve, let's say, and I travel with a constant speed, then whatever the time I reach here, it's the same time I reach here. Can I call that a registration? Just do a constant curve representation. This is very commonly used in a lot of engineering literature. People take curves and they get rid of different parameterization by forcing the arc length parameterization. The problem with that is that when you have objects which are stretched, so this part is stretched between these two objects, this little part is stretched and this part is compressed. When you have this sort of nonlinear transformation, this arc length registration puts you on a completely wrong part. The matching is bad. Okay? So that's not a good solution. So what is the solution? So let's go back to the drawing board. We have a curve here, which I'm calling F. It should be F here. So I have a curve, and let's say it's parameterized by T. So T is in this unit interval 0, 1. For each T, I have a point on the curve, which is F of T. Okay. So this is called the parameterization of the curve. Now, if I take a function gamma, gamma is very similar to the time warping function we studied earlier. And instead of looking at F of T, if I look at F of gamma of T, I compose F with gamma, then T to gamma of T to F of gamma of T could be a different point. So by doing this reparameterization, instead of working with F of T, I work with F of gamma of T. F of gamma of T changes the parameterization of the curve. It's no longer the point Ft, it's now the point F of gamma of T. Okay? But the shape of the curve still remains the same. So remember, I made a point very earlier on that the parameterization or the reparameterization of a curve is also a shape preserving transformation. This curve has exactly the same shape. By changing the parameterization, instead of doing this by doing this, we are simply changing the speed at which we are walking along the curve. We go through the same set of points. And so this set of all time warping functions, this is the group that we had talked about earlier, is also a shape preserving transformation. Here is another example of it. Maybe I don't need to spend too much time on it. It's the same curve 3 different times. These are the 3 different gammas. And this is just simply telling us the rate at which we are walking along the curve. 3 different parameterizations of the same curve. So you get 3 different coordinate functions, but you get exactly the same shape. Shape is not changed. Okay. All right, so now there are 2 things we want. Firstly, we want to do shape analysis of these curves, which is invariant not only to translation, rotation, and scaling of curves, but also to the reparameterization of the curve, because it doesn't change the shape of the curve. Okay, and so we want to have metrics. We want to have ways of doing all the things we want to do in shape analysis, compute shape averages, do PCA, all of the things that I listed earlier on. But we want to do it in a fashion under a metric, let's call it D of S, a shape metric, which is unchanged if we rotate an object, if we scale an object, if we translate an object, or if we reparameterize an object. So that's a very demanding thing that we are putting on our choice of a metric. And clearly you can see L2 will not satisfy this. L2 norm between 2 functions is not the same if you take one function and compose it with a gamma. If you time warp one of the function, if you reparameterize one curve, the L2 norm changes. So L2 norm cannot be used for doing this. We need a certain invariance, and we need to get rid of these transformations, which are in some ways nuisance because they don't affect the shape. Okay. There is another way to look at this problem. One way is to get rid of reparameterization and to have a shape metric which is invariant to all possible reparameterizations of a curve. Other is to actually not think of it as an enemy, but to think of it as a friend and use it for registration. Use it for registration. And this picture shows how. Okay. So suppose I had 2 curves, beta 1 of t and beta 2 of t. Let me just write here, beta, oops. Beta, why is it so thick? Maybe because I'm zoomed in. Beta 2 of t. Okay. So I have these 2 curves. beta 1 and beta 2. So I'm going to use the parametrization to tell me registration, which means for a point t here, I have a point here beta 1 of t. For the same t, I have a point here, which is beta 2 of t. And I will say beta 1 of t is registered to beta 2 of t. Okay. So I will say beta 1 of t is registered to beta 2 of t. So I'll use parametrization as registration. Okay. But suppose I don't like the registration in the way the data is given to me. Somebody gave me one parameterized curve and another parameterized curve, and the parameterization gives me a registration, but it doesn't look good. That's not what I want. I want to change the registration. So I change the registration by changing the parameterization of the second curve. So I'm going to reparameterize the second curve. Instead of working with beta 2 of t, I'm going to work with beta 2 of gamma of t. So now, in this, after the reparameterization, beta 1 of t is now registered to beta 2 of gamma of t. So gamma controls the registration. So if I want to find the best registration, I can search over all possible gammas, and gamma, this reparameterization, gamma, which I called earlier reparameterization, it becomes a registration tool. So it was a nuisance earlier on. I need to get rid of it because it preserves the shape. But instead of getting rid of it and forgetting about it, I actually use it as a tool for doing the registration. How do we do that? So there is some mathematical theory behind it, and I'm going to skip it a little bit, just like I did for the scalar case. For those who are interested, this is what is called an elastic Riemannian metric. There is a metric, just like Fischer Raw Metric I mentioned earlier, which has all the nice invariant properties, but it's a very complicated thing to work with. I don't have time. I'm not explaining it to you because it's complex. What we do in practice is that we replace the curves by their SRVFs, just like we did for functions. But this definition holds for any curve in any Rn. Euclidean curves, okay? Not the curves on the manifold, but curves in a Euclidean space. This definition holds. You simply calculate the derivative of a curve. It's a velocity vector. You calculate the norm. This is the speed. So you divide the velocity by the square root of its speed. And so that's why we call it the square root velocity function. And what is nice thing about this square root representation is that this complicated metric, which has lots of nice mathematical properties, but is complex to work with, under this change of variables becomes the L2 norm. So the distance under the elastic Riemannian metric is simply the L2 norm between the SRVFs of two curves. So just like the scalar functions we do with these curves, we work with the SRVFs of the curves. There's a lot of nice, interesting properties, very simple one-line, two-line proofs. This says that if I start with two curves, F1 and F2, and reparameterize both of the curves in the same way, then this distance, the L2 norm between their SRVFs, does not change. This is invariant. And that's a very important property to have for shape analysis. And so that leads to the following setup. Remember, in the shape analysis of curves, I want to get rid of rotation, translation, scaling, and reparameterization. And also, I want to do registration. And so we do this. Let's start looking at how we do this. Remember, I had a curve, which was, let's say, a curve in a plane, 0, 1 to R2. So this was a parameterized curve. I compute its SRVF. So SRVF is Q of t equals F dot of t divided by the magnitude of F dot t. Okay. And what are the properties of this Q? Firstly, this Q is already invariant to translation. This Q is already invariant to translation because I'm working with the derivative of F. The derivative of F is invariant to translation of F. If I add a constant to F, nothing changes. which is a great thing because I want my shape analysis to be invariant to translation. So I already get it for free. I want to be invariant to scaling. So what we do is when we work with shape analysis of curves, we rescale all the curves to be of unit length. So I want to analyze the shapes of these curves. I showed pictures earlier at the start. There at the start. We rescale all of these curves to be of unit length. So the scale variability has been removed. That's how we get rid of the scale variability. So that's scale. How do we get rid of rotations and reparameterization? There is no simple solution. There is no standardization I can do to remove those beforehand. Okay. So we use this nice property that if I rotate two curves in the same way, or if I reparameterize two curves in the same way, then the L2 norm between their SRVFs remains unchanged, either under rotation or under reparameterization. And so we form orbits. If I have a certain curve, I compute its SRVF, and we look at all possible rotations and translations of that curve, and they form an equivalence class and an orbit. And that whole equivalence class represents one shape in a unique fashion. If you have two different shapes, we can prove that they have two different equivalence classes. There is no intersection. These equivalent classes, either they completely overlap or they are completely disjoint. Okay. They partition the space. And the shape is defined by comparing these equivalence classes in the following fashion. There is little bit of mathematics that we'll have to walk through because we rescaled all the curves to be of length L. There is another nice property that we get, which is that the norm of this, the L2 norm of an SRVF is the same as the length of the curve. So if the length of the curve is 1, that means we are dealing only with SRVFs, Q functions, whose L2 norm is 1. So if you're working with functions whose L2 norm is 1, that means we are only working in a unit sphere. We are not working with a full L2 space. We have restricted ourselves to only those functions whose norm is 1. So they are in a unit sphere, and this unit sphere is called a pre-shaped space. And because in this space, if we change the parameterization of a curve, or if you rotate a curve, we get a different Q function. And so that's why it's called a pre-shaped space. And later on, there is a slight mistake here. This should have been S infinity here. And by forming these orbits, we form a quotient space, and that quotient space is called the shape space of planar curves. It's a proper space, a lot of nice mathematical properties, and we can show that any two curves which have exactly the same shape, they may differ in rotation, they may differ in translation, they may differ in parameterization, but if they have the same shape, they map to the exact same orbit in this space. We can compute distances between shapes. Before you align the shapes, before you register the shape, you can compute the distance. The distance is just arc length in a sphere. If you have a sphere and you have 2 points on a sphere, then the arc length is simply given by the cosine inverse of the inner product. It's useful. But just like we were doing the alignment and the registration of scalar functions, we can do alignment and registration of these curves. There we only had time warping. Here we call it reparameterization, but additionally, we also have rotation. If we have two objects, we can rotate one to best align with the other object. We don't need to do translation, we don't need to do scaling, but we have to do the rotation, and we have to do the reparameterization, which tells us what is the best registration. And once we have solved best rotation and best reparameterization, then we have a way of finding the shortest path between any 2 points in this space. Okay, and this is the shortest path on a sphere is called a geodesic. Anybody who has ever flown in an airplane, you know that when you go from one city to another city, you take the shortest path This path does not look like a straight line on a flattened map. It's the shortest path on the globe, on the sphere, and the equation of the shortest path is exactly that. And how do we use these things? Let me just go to that. Let me just look at this example. So somebody gives us two curves. So this curve is F1. This curve is F2. Somebody gives us these two curves. And our goal is to do shape analysis of these two curves. Okay. We compute for this curve, it's SRVF Q1. We compute as SRVF Q2. We find the best rotational alignment and best reparametrization of one of them, let's say Q2. One could have done it with Q1. I forgot to mention this in the previous module, that these things are perfectly symmetric because they are proper distances. Whether we align Q2 to Q1 or we align Q1 to Q2, we get exact same answer. It's just inverse of each other. Okay. Which is nice. As I said, in L2, penalized L2 optimization, this symmetry does not hold and makes the whole analysis somewhat questionable. But here we take Q1 and Q2, we fix Q1, we change nothing in Q1, find the best rotation of Q2, best reparametrization of Q2, and there are algorithms for doing that. And once we have these two algorithms, then we apply those rotations and reparameterizations, and in that space, find the shortest path between those two points in a unit sphere. And so these are the points along. So let me just try to draw this sort of in a cartoon sense, that there is a unit sphere. This is F1 in an abstract space. This is F2. So this whole function is actually Q1. This is SRVF of Q1. This is SRVF of Q2. They are all normalized, so they sit in a sphere, a Hilbert sphere, infinite dimensional sphere. And once we have found the best registration, let's call this Q2 star. We have found the best registration of Q1 and Q2 to Q1. Then we can just simply compute the shortest geodesic using this equation that I listed here. And this gives us this geodesic, and what we are looking at, what are these shapes that we are looking at, are the points along this path. Equally spaced points along this path. Since these were shapes, each point here is a shape. And so you see each one of these points is a shape along that geodesic. So the first one is given one and the last one is given one, but in the middle, what we are seeing are the points along the geodesic. So these geodesics look quite natural. They look quite satisfying. When we first did it, it was a very exciting result. Why? Because of how things were done previously. So let's look at this example on the top, the hands. I have a certain curve. This is F1. This is F2. And if I compute the geodesic using what was done previously, if I just do arc length parameterization of this curve, arc length parameterization, and fix that registration and draw a geodesic, this is what I get. And you can see that these, somewhere the things are not quite lining up well. But instead of doing that, if I actually compute SRVFs, compute Q1, Q2, find the best rotation, and I find the best registration of point. This is the critical part. The peak should match with peaks, the valley should match with valleys. And somebody asked the question about if you have more peaks than on one object than the other object, then this additional peak should die down when I go from one object to the other. And you see that these hands have more peaks and valleys than this, and this extra finger just simply dies down along the way. There is a little bit of a bending of other finger, the fingers bend, the fingers, where there is a bending needed, you do bending, where there is stretching needed, you do stretching, where there is a compression. So this is why sometimes this shape analysis is called elastic shape analysis, because by doing registration, you take into account the need for stretching parts in order to match them across objects. But this is fully automatic. We don't go and find where are the fingers and where are the thumbs and so on. This is fully as the curves are given. In the top part, in the old approach, like Kendall's approach, this is the result you will get. And here, the problem was we did not solve for the registration. Here we actually solve for registration additionally. And you can see these geodesics are much more natural. The deformation between shapes are much more natural. They are preserving the shapes. They're preserving the peaks and valleys. If you ask me what is an average of this shape and this shape, I will say the halfway point is the average. And this is a much better representative of an average than this one. This is often called the non-elastic deformation. And you can do this arbitrarily for many more examples. These are some examples with nanoparticles. These are some examples with shapes of a bird with another bird, a crown with a hand, a fish with another fish, and this hand with this hand. So not only we are getting in this mechanism a geodesic which is telling us how to deform this shape into that shape, we can calculate the length of the geodesic, which tells us what is the difference or the distance between the two shapes. In the process, when we solve for the optimal gamma, not just the rotation, but optimal gamma, we also get these registration, dense registration. It is telling us which point on one shape is matching with one point. And you can see these matchings are not linear matching. Sometimes they spread out, sometimes they stretch based on the need, based on the geometry. One can do this in higher dimension. Nothing I said is limited to curves in 2 dimensions. This could be done between these curves. So very simple examples of these helical curves. So fully automatic, you feed this data, the XYZ coordinates of 2 curves into the program. It finds this optimal time warping or optimal registration function gamma, which says that this should be the registration. And under this registration, this should be the geodesic. Once again, you can do with compare one helical curve with 3 helical curves, and it will match one with one. And one may say, why not match with this? Because it's measuring the amount of stretching, amount of work that you have to do in any matching. So this particular solution it comes up with, that's the amount with the least, that's the solution with the least amount of work. It matches this one with the middle one. Matching this with the other 2 would have been more work. So they would have been local solution, but not global solutions. Okay. And this is the geodesic you get. Here are examples with some very simple protein, the simplest proteins you have. And we have a way of deforming a protein into another protein. So you can actually start doing analysis. This is an example in very, very high dimensional space. At each time, we observe a skeleton of a person. The skeleton is composed of 21 points, 21 joints. Each joint has 3 coordinates. So this skeleton is an element of r to the power 63, 21 times 3. So if you look at its evolution in time, this is a curve in 63 dimensional space. And we have one observation. We have one function in this one curve in 63 dimensional space. We have another curve in 63 dimensional space. And we want to know what is the registration. In one sequence, the person lifts hand here. In another sequence, the person lifts hands a little bit earlier. A person is performing certain action and you perform the action slightly differently. You're not always synchronized. Even if you're swinging a golf stick, it's the same person swinging the same golf stick in the same location, you will not be synchronized. You have some time variability. That's a very difficult, challenging problem in this analysis of activities or actions of human body. But using this registration, you can do the registration, find the optimal gamma, apply on it, and then you can see that these sequences are much better registered in time, but seen as curves in r to the power 63. But the mathematics is exactly the same, and you can do this in many different ways. Okay. What can you do with this? Once you have this shape metric, at the end, after you do the registration, what you get is called a proper shape metric. It's symmetric, it satisfies triangle inequality, it's positive definite, so on and so forth. Using this shape metric, you can do many things. You can do clustering. So we have this 5 times 4, we have these 20 shapes. We can compute their distances, pairwise distances, how different the shapes are, and you can do the clustering based on different clustering techniques. And if we stare at these things, we'll find out that this algorithm, this metric is quite successful in clustering different objects. Here are some more examples of different objects, and we do the clustering. These are the clustering of nanoparticles working with Chivu. So we had a collection of nanoparticles and we clustered them, and each row is a different cluster. So within a row, you see the shapes are somewhat similar. So if you see this particular row, you see a more spherical, simpler objects. If you see this row, you see more 8-like shapes. Sometimes it fails because the method for clustering is also not perfect. We use an inbuilt algorithm in MATLAB. These shapes should have been clustered here rather than there, but more or less overall, it gets quite similar structures within the cluster. Shape clustering. So these are the clusterings of 3D curves, these helical curves. So we have 3 of these curves, 3 of these curves, 3 of these curves, and 3 of these, based on the number of counts. And you can see it's very nicely clustered in the groups of 3s. Perfect clustering. Again, fully automatic. There is no parameter tuning, but it's actually measuring the shapes. What else can one can do with it? Because you have proper shape distances, you can define a shape mean. What is a mean? Mean is a shape that minimizes sum of squares of distances to the given shapes. I'll give you a code, computer program, which can do that. So here is a set of nanoparticle shapes, and we compute its average by minimizing the sum of squares of distances. This shows the minimization. So given a collection of these shapes, a large collection of the shapes, we can compute an average shape. Because we can compute an average, and there are some examples in a higher dimensional space, there are ways of computing covariances. So this is a part I'm not quite explaining as clearly, but once you have a mean, there is a way of flattening the manifold and computing covariances in a flattened manifold. That's quite loaded, and I don't have quite all the tools to explain it to you. But once you have the covariance, you can compute the Pca of the covariance. And one of the beautiful things about this tool is you can steer along different principal directions. So this is the first principal direction, this is the second principal direction, and this is third. And you can say, what is the variability along the first principal direction? In the middle is the mean. This is the negative direction of the first principle. This is the positive direction of the first principle. And you can actually visualize how shapes are changing along the principal directions. So you can see that this figure of 8 is forming very prominently along the first principal direction. The second principal direction, the variability is like this. Third is like this. People use these, like physicians use this to detect the principal modes of variability in the shape data. So if you have lots of human subjects and you're looking at computational anatomy, you want to know how is the shape varying, shape of a subcortical structure in the brain, how is it varying from person to person? You can compute the mean shape, you can compute covariances, and you can look at the principal components of the PCA. okay, of the covariance matrix. You can go even further. You can actually define something called normal distributions on these manifolds. And then you can use these distributions to actually do the testing of populations. I posed this problem earlier on. Suppose you have two populations. How do you do a two-sample test? You can do this non-parametrically, or you can do this with Gaussian distributions, but adapted to these metrics and these spaces. Here is an example of visualizing the principal components of these leaf shapes. Here are the set of samples obtained from a particular species. This is very enlarged view of the mean shape of these samples. And you can see they have very similar structures, but they're not exactly at the same locations, and the pointedness is not exactly at the same location. If we just start averaging these contours without registration, we lose all the structure. But by doing the registration, we get a very structured mean. And when we look at the principal variation along the first mode, so if we move along the first mode, this is the mean, plus direction of the first mode and the negative direction of the first mode. This shows us how the shape changes along the first mode. This shows how the shape changes along the second mode. And this shows us how the combination of these two modes, the shape change. So one can very nicely visualize the dominant modes of variability in shape data sets. And one can do classifications. Here is the Pca of spiral curves. So I have about 20 spiral curves. I compute their average. Their average looks like this. Then I compute their Pca, which I'm not showing here, but here is one more step I went. I not only did a Pca, I imposed a statistical model by setting the coefficients, the principal coefficients, to be IID Gaussian, with variances given by this observed singular values of the covariance matrix. And then I can generate random coefficients from that Gaussian model. And because I have these coefficients, I can reconstruct the original shapes. I can traverse all the way back my path, and I can actually look at these random shapes. And you can see these shapes are quite realistic. These are random. I started from these 20 shapes. I computed the mean, I computed the covariance, I computed principal directions, I computed singular values. And I imposed a very naive Gaussian model on these coefficients, and I regenerated curves. And I visualize these original curves, and I get these random curves, which look quite realistic. And sometimes I can do this by just using 3-4 coefficients. I don't have to use, even though the curves have 100, 200 points on it, they are very high dimensional curves. But by just using 1, 2, or 3, 4 dimensional variability in the principal component space, I can get very nice variability in the original space. So one can view it as a way of imposing statistical distributions on shapes. One can use it as a tool for dimension reduction, doing statistical analysis. But remember, this was not doing principal component analysis of the original curve as functions. I went through this whole path of representing them with their SRVFs, aligning them to their mean, registering them, and then performing all of the remaining downstream statistical analysis. Okay, so this is good timing. Now I'm back on time. I want to stop this and spend some time explaining set of codes that I posted on your website. And by the way, if you have any question, this is a good time to ask questions about shape analysis of functions, shape analysis of curves, planar curves, or high dimensional curves. Okay. So I'll stop and curve shape data analysis. In functional data alignment, I have 2 sets of codes. Pairwise alignment, which means I have 2 functions and I'm aligning one function to another. And multiple alignment, that means I have a bunch of functions that I am aligning to all of them together to each other. The key to running these codes, let me see if I'm in the correct directory. The key to running all of these codes is that there is a C file which makes everything run faster. If I do this in MATLAB, it will be much slower. There is a C file, you have to compile it using Max. For those who are familiar with Max, that's fine. But if you're not familiar with Max, you have to do something like this, Max and the file name in C. And if your compiler is already connected to MATLAB, it will do the compilation. If it is not connected, then you will have some trouble. You have to figure out how to do it. And that's something that the burden falls on you to do it. But if it compiles, it will say Max completed successfully, and it generates a Max file which looks like this Maxi, because this is for a Mac computer that is doing. And once this is done, then you can run the codes. And so let me just go to pairwise alignment. I'm going to show you pairwise alignment using just the L2 norm, non-penalized L2 norm. I'll show you a quick example because this part of the code is not programmed in C, so this is somewhat slower. Let me even start it. And once it takes a few seconds to finish. This is not a code I actually use in my shape analysis. This is the old-fashioned L2 alignment that people use. I just wanted to show one example of what I called earlier a pinching problem. So, well, it's still going on. Let me remove this window. It is still running. So it's not just few seconds, it's actually getting into a minute. Well, here it is. So let me explain what this picture is. On the top left, I'm showing the two functions, f1 and f2. And in fact, these functions are very nice in the sense that f2 is just a multiple of f1. It's just twice f1. I wanted to show this example in a very simple simulated setting. And whenever you have a function which is just a constant multiple of another function, the functions are already perfectly aligned. One should not do anything to it. But if I use the L2 norm to align it, this is what it does. You see in the middle panel, top middle panel, it takes the blue function. I'm trying to align the blue to the red. It pinches a part of the blue, and it becomes, this is implemented in a discrete way, so there's some numerical approximation, but in theory, we will have a delta Dirac right on the top of the red. So the L2 norm between the two functions will go arbitrarily close to 0. And if in the bottom row, if I run it in the reverse fashion, instead of warping blue, now I'm going to warp red. And if I warp red, what it does is it takes one point, the peak point of red, and splits it into a horizontal line. And then it does this alignment. And so in one case, it pinches a part of the curve completely. In another case, in the opposite case, it just flattens, stretches completely apart one point, okay? And if we compute the L2 norm in the two cases, the answers are very different. And so this is a problem with this L2 norm. And I just wanted to show you one example. There are many more examples in the code. This was called pairwise alignment F. Okay? But now I'm going to do the alignment with SRVFs, pairwise alignment SRVFs. So basically what I'm doing is I'm running the same program, but I insert the calculation of SRVF. So I start with F1 and F2. And let me even take the same exact examples as the previous case. So I have two functions where F2 is just a twice of F1. So they're perfectly aligned. I don't want to do anything with them. I compute their SRVFs, and then I apply this dynamic programming. And this is now a Max code, a C code called from MATLAB. So this will go very fast. So let me just run it. And that's where it happened. It just did it. It was that fast. I click the button and it does it because it's been programmed in C. Now let's look at the results. The results are, because F1 and F2 were originally well aligned, nothing happens. F2 remains more or less same. And you can see there is a slight numerical error because we are actually calculating the gamma function on a discretized grid. In dynamic programming, one uses a grid. And because of this grid, there are some little bumps. Ideally, this should have been exactly a 45-degree line, the warping function. And if we do it the other way around, we warp the red one to align with blue, again, nothing happens. And we get warping function as a straight line. So this SRVF based alignment is meaningful if the functions are already aligned. Don't do anything. But L2 does not follow that. So now let me take another example, another pair of functions F1 and F2 and run them. And this is what I get. So on the top left, I show you two functions, F1 and F2. F1 is in red, F2 is in blue, and I'm time warping F2 to align with F1. So this is the middle panel, top middle, shows the alignment, the time warping of the blue to align with red. Blue has been time warped, and you can see the peaks have been perfectly aligned. Okay. In the bottom, you see the reverse process. Now the red is being time warped to align with the blue. And you can see the blue remains as it is, and this is very nicely aligned. And if I take the two warping functions, the forward warping and the backward warping, and if I compose them, on the bottom right, I get a near perfect 45-degree line. That means the two solutions are honest to God inverses of each other. And there is no pinching. Okay? So we get a very nice alignment. Now let me take a third example. I forget what this example is. Comment out this one. So I have an example where in the blue, I have two peaks. They're not as prominent and they're quite close to each other, but the alignment is still meaningful because of the stretching. You remember we have this elastic metric. This whole thing is quite elastic. So it takes the two peaks and stretches the blue in the top row, in the top sequence of panels to align with the red, and we get a certain warping function. In the bottom, it takes the red and compresses the separation of the peaks, brings them closer to align with the peaks. Okay. So as you can see, these are all simulated functions, but the alignment works quite nicely. And this is pairwise alignment. But now I can do another case. And so I want to show examples of multiple alignment. If somebody gives us not two functions, but many functions, I have in the other folder a code which is called test run. And there are a bunch of data sets that are already loaded in there. You can just comment one in, comment one out. I'll start with this thing called simu data. And I will run the code for alignment. This is in a different folder. So it runs through a certain iterations, and this is what the result is. It's that fast. I showed you this particular picture earlier. The left picture is what goes into the code. And the right two pictures are the output of the code. The align function, which we call the amplitudes, the time warping functions, which are called the phase. Fully automatic, there is no tuning of any parameter. Let me change it to something different, another data, another simulated data, but somewhat more drastic. On the left, we have these unimodal functions with arbitrarily shifted peaks. And then on the right, you have the fully aligned function. Okay. That's right. Works very nicely. It aligns very well. This is a technology which is about maybe 10 years old. Let me show what we have in this demo data sets. But so far, nobody has beaten this in terms of alignment performance. Another set of program, these functions. So they are, most of the functions are bimodal, but some of the functions in this set are actually unimodal. So not all functions have the exact same number of peaks. And so again, you saw it run in real time, and on the right is the output, which is the alignment. Another example. 30 functions. I think it's a simulated data of some kind. I forgot what it really looks like. It runs through the iteration. Every iteration, it improves the alignment, and then it does a final centering. So this is quite a challenging example. On the left, you have functions. They have very different locations of the peaks. They have very different number of peaks sometimes. Some have 2 peaks, some have 3 peaks. And on the right, you see the alignment. Okay. It's near perfect alignment, and nothing one can fault for that. There are some real data sets. The growth data set I mentioned is already there, and you can play with it. All right, so this was about the functional alignment. Now I want to talk about curve shape analysis. And the first example I have is something called elastic planar geodesic. So let me just quickly run it, and then I will explain to you what it does. So it generates 2 outputs. And I think in your codes, I don't have the second figure, the code I posted, the second figure. That's something I added this morning. But what it does, this particular code, there is a shape database, which I put in there. It randomly picks up 2 pictures, 2 shapes, shape 1 and shape 2, the first and the last shape. It performs the registration, it performs the alignment and registration, and forms the geodesic, the shortest path between the 2 shapes with full elastic registration. And every time you run it, it randomly picks up 2 shapes. And it does this, and you will see that registration is very natural, it's very non-linear, and the deformation between the 2 shapes is very natural. It also gives you a distance between the 2 registrations, and it computes the best alignment. Oh, that was my son walking through. Let me just run a few more examples. And so for random shapes, it just computes geodesics, geodesic distance, and elastic geodesics, as I call them. Now, as a last piece of code for the shape analysis of planar curves, I do something slightly different, which is somewhat more statistical analysis. So I take a number of shapes. I have to redraw this so that it shows again slightly better. Let me fill this program and run this again. So I have these shapes. In this case, there are 11 shapes. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to compute their mean shape. So for example, if you have some number of nanoparticles and you want to know what is the average shape, and these seem quite lined up, but you could have given me the data in arbitrary rotations, arbitrary parameterizations. You could have taken these curves from arbitrary images, and that would have not changed the analysis at all. And so this is running. What it does is it at every iteration, it computes the deformation to individual shapes. So I have 11 shapes. Every iteration, it computes the geodesic to each one of the 11 shapes and updates the mean in each iteration. So it runs 3 or 4 iterations. It has run 3 iterations almost, and it's going to do 1 more iteration. So I'm looking for an average shape. And you can see they have similar shapes, but they're not quite similar. They have sometimes different number of these indentations, different strengths. In the bottom left, you see it comes out a lot more. And in one of the shapes, it doesn't come out. And so this turns out in 4 iterations to be the average shape that we get. I hope everybody can see my screen. These were the original shapes, and this is the average shape. And if you look at the code, in the code, we go back and do some more things. We not only compute the mean, we compute the covariance. I have it paused, but I can pull up the code. It computes the covariance. It computes principal component analysis, and it shows some additional analysis based on these principal coefficients. In fact, it imposes a Gaussian model on these principal coefficients using these parameters learned from this data, and generates random shapes from this Gaussian model based on this data set. So here is an example. There are a few things we are displaying here. I will have to sort of rescale these things. So this is a panel that shows the variation along the first principal direction. So the shape in the middle is the mean. On the left is the negative side of the first principal direction. On the right is the positive side of first principal direction. I wish I had rescaled the windows before I draw this, but let me see if I can rescale and rerun just this part of the curve of the code. To improve the display, I'm going to just rerun this part. It will take seconds. It just recomputes geodesics from the mean to these individual shapes. There are 11 shapes. And hopefully gives me a slightly better display. So right, this is the principal variability in the original 11 shapes. I'm working, remember, I'm working from these 11 shapes. That's all I have. From this 11, I computed a mean. I computed a covariance. I'm showing you the visualization, how the shape changes along the first principal direction, how the shape changes along the second principal direction. You can sort of try to interpret these results. And I'm showing you some random shapes generated from Gaussian model on these principal coefficients. So one can dictate, these were the original shapes and these are the random shapes that I'm generating. So you can say that, I mean, they are not perfectly spot on, but they are actually quite realistic shapes. They preserve the symmetry, they preserve the nature of these indentations. They're quite interesting shapes. And of course, instead of using the Gaussian model, I could have put some other model. I could even have done it non-parametrically. Could have put some non-parametric model on the coefficients, joint models, because they are statistically independent. And then I could have done random sampling from a non-parametric model. I could have done some Bayesian analysis of these coefficients. So this is the second set of codes. Let me close all the windows. So getting back to my set of codes that I provided, for functional alignment, I give you pairwise functional alignment, how to align two functions, or I give you multiple functional alignment. Give me n number of functions, it aligns, and I give you some number of data sets to play along. There are README files in each directory. For shape analysis of curves, I give you a program on how to compute a deformation and a distance between any two shapes. But then if you give me a bunch of shapes, maybe from a same population, I can compute their mean and covariance and principal components. There is a toolbox that goes with this, and so one can link. This toolbox has been linked in these programs, and one can compute these things. So let me stop, and now I want to talk in the end for 5, 10 minutes, 15 minutes maybe about more complex objects. So far we talked about scalar functions. We talked about planar curves. That's where we spend most of the time because they are pictorially easy to explain. But we can do, or we have done things for somewhat more complicated objects. The first objects are surfaces. So examples are these. So you have three-dimensional objects and we are looking at surfaces of these objects. And we are going to repeat the exact same agenda that somebody gives us two objects. We want to know how to deform one object into another, how to align and register points on one object with points on another object, dense registration, full registration. And once we have that, how to deform, how to optimally deform one object into another. What is the geodesic? Okay. And so there is some mathematical theory, and certainly I don't have time. My intention is just to give you some pictorial examples. And if you're interested, if you need to use these tools, you can certainly ask me for references. And so here are some examples that if we do the deformation without registration, just like a 2D hand, we have the same thing with 3D hand. With registration, the geodesics are very nice. we have these human body database, hundreds of subjects. Each one of these subjects are in these things we call neutral pose. They just stand with their arms apart. And then for these, how can we compute an average shape? I mean, it's a good question we may have wondered about, that if we have lots of human body shapes, what is an average human body? It turns out for these 100 human subjects, this is the average body. Because we have shape distances, we can cluster the shapes of human body in different groups. And in this case, it turned out, coincidentally, the clustering based on our metric was perfectly broken into male and female human bodies. It's not something that we assigned, male separately, female separately, but the metric does that too. Once we have a metric, we can actually do a principal component analysis. We can say, what is the most common mode of variability in the human body? So we compute this average shape and we visualize the shape variability along the first principal component, the second principal component, the third principal component, and so on. And a lot of people agree with us that the first principal variability in the data in the human body is along the male-female bodies. This is the male direction, this is the female direction. That's the most common, the most important significant variability. And then along the other modes, it's not so easily interpretable. There is more of tall, thin people, and this is more of a stocky stature. We can also look at, this was the example of the same human, but in different poses. We can compute averages. And we went ahead and we actually simulated random shapes of different poses and different shapes using these Gaussian models on the principal components. So these are randomly generated shapes with some poses, these sort of poses with hands apart, but with the different body shapes. One can always debate whether they were really good examples or bad examples. Another set of objects that we have worked with are these tree-like objects. And the tree-like objects, mathematically, we model them as collection of curves. So we have studied how to do individual curves, but now we have collection of curves. And we have two such curves where we have a main curve and we have side branches. So we have a main branch and side branches. So whenever we are comparing two curves, we always compare the main curve with the main curve and the side branches with the side branches. But of course, what we don't know in advance is which side branch should be matched with which side branch. This curve may have different number of side branches. That tree may have different number of side branches. So this is a matching problem. This is solved using an algorithm called Hungarian algorithm. And I want to show you some examples. So here's an example of a geodesic. So there is one neuron, external neuron. Here is another external neuron. And we perform a registration between points. First, we perform registration between branches, and then the registration between points along the branches. And then we actually compute geodesics. The top row shows the same thing, but with much simpler structure. But you can understand the difficulty in doing that. Not only we are trying to figure out which point on a curve goes to which point, we are even trying to figure out which branch goes to which branch. So there is a layer of difficulty in registration when we handle that, and we use this for classification. Here is another example of matching trees. In fact, I want to show you some videos of these trees. Let me stop here. So just to set up the problems, the botanists, they use laser scanners to give us 3D models of trees. They're asking the question, how to compare shapes of these full trees. So in principle, we do exactly what I've been telling about. We use representation through a collection of curves and so on. And I just want to show you some videos. This is a video. This video denotes a geodesic. It's a geodesic that starts with one tree, goes through a sequence of deformation, and ends up with the second tree. So we started with one tree. I hope you can see my screen. And it ends up with a second tree. And these are the most optimal deformations between these two trees. Let me run it again. These are very complex structures. I have some more examples. Oops, not that panel, this panel. I want to deform this tree into another trees. This is a very complex calculation. A lot is going on there. It's hard to explain everything because not only there are secondary branches, there are sometimes tertiary branches, and they're being mashed in a hierarchical fashion, and we are computing full geodesics between these things. And finally, let me show you this example. I really love this. When my collaborator generated this thing, it was so beautiful. I stared at it like a movie, like a Netflix movie for many hours, just to understand all the deformation. Two very different kind of trees, one being deformed into another using these geodesics. And not only these, we are getting these geodesics, we are actually getting the length of the geodesic, which tells us how different are the shapes. And if I stop at the halfway point, I don't know if it allows me to stop. This halfway point is actually a statistical average, a mean shape of the first tree and the last tree. This was the first tree, this is the last tree, and somewhere in between halfway point is an average of the two trees. So we are being able to compute averages of those two trees. And we have done this not just with two trees, we have done this with many trees. So just showing you examples of more complex structures that we have worked with, things like trees. And then I had some more complicated examples, which I didn't want to quite show because I won't have time to explain, but things like brain arterial networks. If we go back to the very first slides where I introduced the problem, we have very complex graphs, which are not even quite trees. You think of the road network. Road network is not like you have a main road and just branches coming out of that main road. You have roads just connecting to each other, forming a graph. How do you compare one road network for one densely populated city with a road network for something which is a less populated city or another densely populated city? So it's a very simple, similar story, not simple, I should not have said that. It's a very similar story. We represent them as collection of curves. We try to match curves with curves. But this time, instead of just matching trees, we have to match graphs. So we have a whole line of work where we're talking about shapes of graphs. Okay? So this sort of concludes my presentation. I want to leave some time for question and answers. But just to summarize, I've given you some highlights on a field. This is not just one problem. It's not just shape analysis. It's not just functional data analysis. This is a field which represents coming together of ideas from geometry, from statistics, from functional analysis. So it interests mathematicians, applied mathematicians, engineers, geometers, and statistics and data analysis also. What is the reason for bringing together shapes and functions? Because on one hand, objects are more naturally represented by continuum. If you represent objects by discrete points, you have no longer the flexibility to change their registration. If you have discrete points, they are already pre-registered. This is what was done previously in the shape analysis by Kendall and other people. So by representing them as functions, we have more flexibilities. So that's one reason. On the other hand, even for functional data analysis, even people who say, I do functional data analysis, but I don't care about shape data analysis, they should realize that functions have shapes. COVID curves have shapes. Growth rates have shapes. Financial data have shapes. And so one should use shape analysis tool to analyze functions. So because of these two reasons, there is a natural motivation for doing this together. So the simplest example of functional data analysis and shape data analysis coming together is scalar functions. But as the data becomes more complex, the complexity of the analysis grows. We start with scalar functions, then we look at curves, curves in a plane, curves in R3, curves in Rn. But then the complexity grows and we have shape-like structures, we have graph-like structures, we have trees, or we have road networks or brain artery networks, or vasculatures in retinal images. Then we have three-dimensional objects like human bodies or faces or other surfaces. And then we can even imagine these 3D objects with some branching structures. And so it gets even more and more complicated. So the future is quite rich. There is a whole lot more to be done. I have talked only about geometrical data analysis, but there is a whole different field called topological data analysis. And one can talk about bringing topological tools additionally into this mix to handle even more complex objects. We have some very complex biomolecules. They sometimes look like curves. Sometimes they look like surfaces. Sometimes they look like blobs. They have holes, they have handles, they have complex topology. So being able to do all of this requires a much more complicated story, much more complicated structure. This is my last slide. I thank you very much for paying attention for this long. It's a very long story.